Everybody, Elizabeth Nader here, back with you tonight. Jersey First TV, bringing you another fun episode, hoping that you guys get a chance to think about the issues we're going to bring up with you tonight. I want to welcome to the show Stephen Rumbolo and AJ Melillo. Guys, Stephen and AJ, welcome to Jersey First TV.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. Well, AJ, you were on our show with the interns, which was great. And it's always good to talk to young people. It makes me feel a little old, but it also gives me hope for the future. So it's important that we talk to you guys and we understand what the 20-somethings are thinking. But tonight specifically, we're going to talk about how two individuals who work together, who live together, who are good friends, but really think on the opposite sides of the aisle about certain issues, how you guys managed to do this. We're going to get into that tonight. But first, we want to talk about your bios and why this actually is an appropriate topic for you guys. Both of you have degrees in this arena, in the political arena. Both of you have been on shows before on the radio that you've managed. So Stephen, you tell us first, tell us about your background, what you do, what you have done that gives us reason to have you on this show.
Well, again, thank you guys for having me so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and sure to share the story about me and AJ. I spent 4 years. I graduated in 2016 from Montclair State University with a bachelor's degree in political science. And then this past May, just graduated with my master's degree in law and governance. So in my time at Montclair State, I also, with AJ, did a radio show where we won many awards, talked about several political topics, interviewed high-profile candidates, people from, Ajit Pai, former chairman of the FCC, to sitting U.S. Congress members. We've been down to D.C. We've done the dirty work, and we kind of made it through, and we're ready to talk about it. So it's a pleasure to be here.
The dirty work is just starting. What do you mean?
You're right. This is like a little lull.
It's a little lull. It's just begun. You'll be fighting in this for decades to come. AJ, you're interning at Jersey First, which is amazing because we've got an incredible internship program, but you've had a lot of experience as well. Tell us about your background.
Sure. Yeah, like Stephen, I graduated with a degree in political science from Montclair State University, and I'm currently in the graduate program for law and governance. Along with Stephen, like he said, we did that radio show at Montclair State. Stephen didn't mention this, but I will, because a little brag about Stephen. He was the news director over at WMSC. I was also the news director, and then I was the station manager after that. We were part of an award-winning crew over at WMSC. We're super proud of our time there. Stephen already mentioned some of the things we did. Along with that, I've interned at Jersey First. I've interned with the NJGOP, and I interned with the David Richter campaign for Congress this last November.
Awesome. Well, the two of you are definitely names to remember and to watch to see what you guys do with this. But you had this radio show together, the Sons of Liberty. You have roomed together. You have done a lot together as friends and colleagues, yet you don't agree. Give me a percentage. How often do you disagree about issues?
In politics or in life? Because I think in life we agree more than in politics.
Yeah.
But I would say we probably disagree on what do you think, Steve? Like 70%, if not more?
I was going to say 75, almost to 80 would be my best shot.
That's not insignificant. And, right now we're on a platform where when people disagree, what they tend to do after yelling at each other right behind their computer screen is they unfriend, unfollow. We're on a platform where you get blocked many times for having certain opinions. Yet in real life, outside of the cyberness of Facebook, you guys disagree, yet you continue to be close friends. What is it that you've been able to do to have a good conversation about an issue without it breaking a relationship? AJ, you tell us first. What do you think it is?
I think, like I said, it's the fact that on the things that really matter, politics are important, don't get me wrong, but I think the things that really matter, knowing where the other person is coming from genuinely. I think that once you realize that most of us kind of are just fighting for the same thing. We just want this place, this country to be better, this world to be a better place. And once you know that that's the starting point, everything else is just semantics, and it's just what you think is better. So I think that that's what it is. It's knowing where the other side is coming from.
Stephen, why does it feel like, you're representing the blue side of this, we'll say, okay? AJ, the red side. But why does it feel like if at all we give in, that the future of the country, everything is going to implode? Why is it getting so incredibly intense right now to the point where people are saying this is our last chance, our last election, it's over, this country is going to, change as we know it? Why are we all of us, so intense about this?
I think for a lot of people, there's been this sort of, and I would, granted, I was really young when it happened, but I would say because of the internet and people have this constant access 24/7, the ability to either exist in a bubble that affirms your beliefs or put yourself in a world where you're always disagreeing with people. You're surrounded by politics. You're surrounded by these issues. And I think a lot of people get consumed, and it's become hyper-partisan, as we've all seen with recent elections, that there's sort of this pressure, and I think it's fake. I don't think it's real. I don't ever have this doom and gloom feeling about the country, about my party, about the other parties. I think that cooperation and understanding and sort of being able to take a step back from the internet and actively listen to each other and engage in relationships like the one I have with AJ are the answer to avoid that. But hyper partisanship 110% is the reason for the panic.
It's interesting you say that, because if you think about the crises we've faced as a country, really since our founding, right? You think about some of the extreme things that have happened in this world. Had the internet existed then, let's say World War II, let's say the Vietnam War, you pick something, right? Had the internet existed then, I think you make a good point. I think we would all have a different experience. And so it's really exasperating our differences, isn't it? AJ, how does someone exist online with friends, maintain those friendships without all this blocking and defriending and all the vitriol that happens? What position do you have to take, or what attitude do you have to employ?
I would say, well, first of all, when it comes to online, it might be best to sort of stay off Twitter and stay off Facebook. And just, if you're going to engage in something that you need more than 280 characters to convey your message, Twitter's not a good place for it, right? So anything that requires a lot of discussion and thought and a well thought out response and feedback is not a place, it's not something to put on Twitter, right? So I think that that's where it begins. It's sort of, use your social networking and your social platforms for good things that require long thought out conversation. I think one of the big reasons that's why we're able to work so well together is that we had a radio show that we had 3 hours in a little box with microphones that we would talk out all of these issues. It wasn't going on Facebook or on Twitter.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sound bites are dangerous, and we've gotten really used to them, right? And it's very difficult to encapsulate an entire point of view or an issue in just a certain number of characters. Let's look at both parties. And again, we're going to kind of give you the default parties here, since we are a two-party system, and that's really all we'll ever be. Stephen, can you kind of give us a state of the state with the Democrats? How do you see things for them right now? How are they faring in this country?
I think the Democrats are in a tough position. I really do, because there's a clear split in our party. I would say you have, reasonable people. You have people who, traditional Democrats, traditional liberals, want the same things they've wanted for decades. And then there's this sort of new Democrat coming in that, I know our former president would dub them like the squad, your AOCs, your super liberal, borderline leftist individuals.
Right.
I think that's going to be trouble for the future of the party, because they're gaining more power. They're gaining more steam in the party. And I'm not going to say one way or the other whether or not I think that's a good or a bad thing, but I think it's something that party leadership needs to address, because anybody, if you cannot represent a unified front, nobody's going to take you seriously. Nobody's going to want to engage with you. And I think it's going to be harder to get people across the aisle to work with us if we can't get our stuff together and have one consistent message.
Stephen, often I hear, and I've said it myself, because I'm a little bit older than you guys, so I remember Kennedy Democrats, if you will, and I have often said, as have others, is that different now? Are Kennedy Democrats really truly Democrats anymore? Where do they fit into your party? Would they actually be Republicans today? I'm curious, Stephen, what you think about that.
I'll be honest with you. I've been compared to Kennedy Democrats of that era, and then I've also had people tell me, "You're not a liberal. You're just a conservative saying you're a liberal." So I totally understand why that perception exists. But I think that if Democrats want to continue to win, they should fight to have traditional Democrats in the party,
Yeah.
because there's still a large portion of the population that believes those things, that, like you said, was around to experience those things in their heyday.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of good that came out of that.
Yeah.
And I think if we want to move forward and really be a progressive party, we have to fight to keep those people in our party.
Yeah, interesting. I think there may be a little crisis of identity there. AJ, what do you think about regarding the Republicans? Let's give them a grade. Where do they stand, both from a good, strong aspect and as well as the weakness?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I think Stephen hit the nail right on the head, and I think that it's the same for both parties. I think there's a fight between the establishment, moderate conservatives, your Mitt Romneys of the world, against your anti-establishment Donald Trumps of the world, right? And that's the Republican Party right now. And so it's not the left against the liberal like it is the Democrats, but I would say it's much more of the establishment against the anti-establishment or the populists in the Republican Party. So I would say it's pretty much the same fight that's going on. It's just sort of a different ideological battle. Yeah. So the question becomes, and I think that it's broader too, the fight is between the establishment and the anti-establishment. And I would say that the traditional Democrat, the traditional Kennedy Democrat, is much more akin to the traditional John McCain Republican, right? And now you have the AOCs who are alongside the Matt Gaetzes, and they're trying to come into the parties and sort of shift the balance of power. So I'd say it's pretty much the exact same fight.
Wow. Yeah, interesting. Interesting analysis of that. One thing that seems different to me, I don't know if you guys agree or disagree, Stephen, it seems like the Democrats protect each other, and AJ, it seems like the Republicans don't do that. Do you both agree with that?
I would say so. And I would say the best example is what happened with Steve King, right? He made remarks that were pretty clearly white supremacists or at the very least, quite close to white supremacists. Right. And the Republican Party stripped him of leadership and donated to the person running against him. And now he's not in Congress anymore. And then you have someone like Ilhan Omar on the Democratic side of the aisle, who's made borderline, if not out and out anti-Semitic comments. And Nancy Pelosi's biggest push against that was saying, we condemn hate from everyone.
Yeah, right. So, right. Stephen, do you see it the same way?
I do, and I'm a little bit ashamed of the party, because I think that I think it seems like an attempt to save face, an attempt to sort of protect our own and this and that. I don't think that needs to be done in a political arena. I think you need to be held accountable for your words. So the example that AJ brought up is exactly what I was going to mention. There's no excuse for that. There's no excuse to, sort of put a bubble around it and not address it and sort of gloss over it because this person has a really big social media presence, or this person is really great with the younger crowd. Right. If they don't stand for the things that the party says that they stand for, you shouldn't be protecting them. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I think most common sense people would agree with that. Let's get into some issues, because this is where it gets really interesting on where you stand on certain issues. Now, I want to start with COVID because it's issue du jour, right? Constantly in the news. So let's just look back a little bit. We have the advent of the pandemic, and we have the response to the pandemic, which started to be a response along political lines, which in itself is a whole conversation that we don't have time for. And now, we've been sort of out of it in some ways. Other states are open, and there's been, again, this sense that maybe we're done. Now it would appear that we're back in it in some way. At this point, Stephen, I'm going to ask you first, as someone who would be considered, sort of reflecting the liberal side of this. How are you feeling about the COVID situation? Where do you stand on this and all of the vitriol now regarding that we're hearing on a daily basis?
I'll say this. The COVID issue politically has been very challenging for me. I think it's made me really think deeply about a lot of things and have a lot of important conversations with people. I think the response in the beginning on everybody's behalf was effective. I think you're talking that first 1 to 2 months where we all kind of didn't know what was going on. We want to get our bearings straight. We want to be safe. We want to protect people who are vulnerable. I get that. And, post vaccination and, this mass vaccination movement that we've had beginning early this year, end of last year.
Right.
And I think I've had a lot of time to think about it. And I really think that there's been some tremendous, I don't want to say violations, but, sort of rifts with individuals' civil rights on a lot of the things that the government was imposing on people and businesses specifically. My heart goes out to small and local businesses.
Yeah.
And having the ability to reflect on that, I think that we have a lot of progress to make to sort of correct the wrongs that have been done. You're talking about millions of families that have lost businesses, that have been out of work. You created this hyper welfare state almost where we live down the shore and we have summer businesses here that can't hire people because the government is paying them more money to collect unemployment. That's a problem.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that we need to fix. And I'll be honest with you, I don't think the Democrats have done any favors for small businesses or individuals to get off those programs and become self-sufficient and individuals again.
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you, that gives me a lot of hope because, again, I know that your views are usually, progressive or liberal. You're a Democrat. But at this point, I'm seeing, AJ, so much COVID fatigue. And, we have been fighting for our rights and our freedoms. And I think in the beginning, there was a sense that we come together, we do what we need to do. And then it just seemed to never end. And so for Stephen to say that maybe it's getting to the point where it's no longer common sense. I personally have been there a lot longer. But for him to say that really gives me hope now that the people unified may stand up against this. AJ, what do you say about it?
Yeah, I would say that it's definitely a hopeful message. I think that Stephen and I have had conversations so often. I mean, we mentioned this before because Stephen and I did live together up until COVID when everybody had to come home from school. And even during that, though, we've spent pretty much every day together for the past 4 years. So I think that in the conversations that we've had, just the two of us, I would say Stephen is right on that first 1 to 2 months. We completely agreed that, we have to figure this out. We don't know what's going on exactly. And once we figure this out, then we'll start to make better decisions. And then I would say that by the summertime, when you started to see cases wane and the restrictions weren't changing at all, and you started seeing some states change restrictions like your Floridas and your North Dakotas, I quickly jumped. I was like, we're doing too much. The vulnerable should stay inside. Everybody else should be pretty much good to go. And then I remember vividly a conversation we had probably around January-ish, where I was speaking to him and another friend, and I was like, look, I don't want to be like this. I don't want to be scared that our government is never going to give us certain things back. But how can I sit here and say that I'm certain that they will when they take power and they never really give that power back? And we had this conversation, and Stephen and our other friend were like, no, like, you can't say that. And I was like, I hope they're right. I really do. I really hope that they're right.
Right.
And then a few months after that, we had another conversation, and Stephen started to I wouldn't say he agreed with me totally, but started to at least see the point of view that it is a scary proposition that this boogeyman, it seems, is always going to be out there for them to cudgel against us.
Yeah, you make a good point. And, Stephen, it really brings up the age-old disagreement between the parties over the size of government, which is something that, I'm curious where you guys, how you guys actually talk about that with each other. But this is like an extreme example of this, right? The size of government has always been this issue where the Republicans want less government and, the Democrats believe the government should be more involved or offering more. I'll let you speak to that. But the COVID response now is extreme government intervention. So has that changed the way you look at big government in general as somebody who tended to be in support of bigger government, I'm assuming?
Yes, definitely for a long time in support of larger government. And I think it's changed my perception pretty drastically. That's not to say I don't believe that big government's a bad thing. I still kind of like big government, but I want to see it operate, and AJ touched on this, with a little less permanency. Because like he said, you create these programs, you have these things that are meant to be temporary, and then they never go away. And that causes so many problems for us as taxpayers. We have to continue to fund these things that we might not need anymore. So we're blowing out government spending, and we're creating a more largely visible functioning government, which scares me a little bit. There's some days I wake up and I don't want to think about what Big Brother's doing in DC.
Yeah.
And COVID especially kind of pushed that in your face every single day for the past almost 2 years now.
Yeah.
And that's really scary to me.
Yeah.
So less permanency. If it's a one-off program for a situational type thing, absolutely. But the permanency's got to go. We got to learn to cut programs, and so many good things will come out of that.
You know, Stephen, be careful. I might give you a red card. I'm starting to think you're coming over. But no, I want to ask you, when you say, you know, generally in the past, like pre-COVID, you were in support of big government. Why, Stephen? Why do you like big government, and what do you believe it does for us?
This is like the age-old question, right? I think for me, big government is, I don't want to say comforting, because I feel like that's a really emotional word, and I don't really feel any particular emotional way about government.
Yeah.
But I feel reassured knowing that the government has a purpose in actively serving its citizenry, the people who, you know, allow it to exist. And I think government should be responsive of that. So if there's a large portion of the population that's asking for certain social benefits or certain money for social programs, and that's going to increase the size of the government and it's going to benefit a lot of people, I have no problem with that kind of thing. It as long as it's being effective in helping the people that allow it to exist and not abusing that power like we sort of saw with COVID.
Yeah.
It makes me really happy, because I think that's the function of government is to serve the people.
Okay, so the social aspect in terms of supporting people that need to be supported. And of course, we could argue whether the state should do that, the federal government, if that should be private institutions, if it should be the churches. But I understand what you're saying. It's the thing that makes you feel good. It's the part of it that says we're helping our fellow man. AJ, of course, the argument against that is kind of what Stephen even alluding to. Once you start this, where do you stop? So weigh in on what big government means to you and why it scares you. I also presume that it does.
Yeah, I would say what's so interesting, and the thing that I have been struggling with in my own mind, is that it seems to me that big government, basically, if that's not there, something else fills the void, right? So what we've seen from the void that is left in certain areas by government is big business and big tech and monopolies in that area. So I think big things just scare me. Something with too much power, and I'm a small guy, so like even big people scare me sometimes. You know what I mean? Like things with too much power are frightening.
Yeah.
So I think that the issue isn't inherently that there's an issue with big government. There's an issue with large things with a lot of power that are held unaccountable, right? So the question becomes is, what is a more effective measure of accountability? Is it, if there's big business, then there's a free market that's there to hold them accountable? Or is it that there's big government and there's voters that are there to hold them accountable? Because right now we have both. Right? And the big government is helping the big business cram down on the little people, you know, the normal people. So I think that big things are the frightening. And usually, probably before COVID, Steve and I would have this discussion, and the argument would be, you know, big business, at least the free market's there. And Stephen would argue, no, but big business, it's greedy. It's not like the government is. The government should have the interest of the people in line. Right. But after COVID, I think for both of us, we look at this and we say, well, big business's only goal, well, I say now, and I'm sure Stephen would agree, big business's only goal is two things: make money and keep you on, if it's big tech, keep you on their platform. And how do they do that? Derive division. And what's big government's only thing? More power and making you need them, making you vote for them because you need them. So I think the problem in our country is that we rely too heavily on big things. And when our country was at its best, we had very limited government, and we had much more reliance on small businesses, family-run businesses, local businesses.
Yeah.
No Walmart and Target big chains. Sure, there was J.P. Morgan and there was the oil companies, and they were the big businesses of that time in the 1920s, is what I would think back to. And I will note, obviously, the country wasn't perfect in 1920, but Calvin Coolidge is my favorite president.
Oh, well, okay, there you go. You're going to throw that gauntlet down. So listen, the way you say that is so interesting. Stephen, it's big things that scare him. I mean, you can kind of see that, right?
Absolutely. And this, I think, goes back to what we were saying in the beginning, where the thing that makes our friendship work is understanding that at the same day, or at the end of the day, we want the same thing pretty much, because the same way, AJ just aired out some gripes with big business. We could do a whole nother 30 minutes on the problems I have with big business, your Amazons, your, like you said, your Walmarts and then your big tech. And I think that's the beauty of the friendship, is that we have this issue here, and I'm a little bit on this side of the solution, he's a little bit on this side of the solution, but we agree this is the problem. How are we going to fix it and make it better for everybody and be considerate of other people?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm amazed by what you guys are saying, because I have to tell you honestly, not just COVID, but I'm hopeful, because what I'm hearing is that you're both seeing that we need to change the right thing. So in the past, a true capitalist, I am one, would be pro business no matter what. However, anything out of bounds is not good. And as AJ says, anything too big is not good. So now all of a sudden, I think pure capitalists are even saying, hey, big tech, big business, not so good. So all of a sudden we're coming together on that. We're coming together on the government thing. There is a lot here that I think is really, really interesting. I want to just end on some financial things, all right? Because there are a lot of issues that we could get into. But when we think about big government, what funds big government? Taxpayer money, right? The government has no money except for yours and mine. And so, people forget that sometimes conveniently. So we look at a state like New Jersey, heavily taxed, really burdened. I want to talk specifically about one issue just to sort of highlight maybe the differences of opinion or how you look at it. The Millionaires Tax that was passed, which is really, one of the heaviest in the nation, if not the heaviest, which is arguably pushing millionaires out of the state. Stephen, how do you feel about our tax structure specific to that issue, which affects small business owners?
It's really tricky, because I do agree, being the blue guy on the show, I do agree that there should be some sort of extra taxation on people who make, enormous amounts, create enormous amounts of wealth for themselves. That being said, I'm also reasonable enough to understand the issue in driving out millionaires, driving out, these businesses from your state, because at the end of the day, if they leave, you have a tax that you're not going to make any money from because there's nobody there to tax, right? So there's got to be, and this is what I would say is the key to this, is a fairness scale when you're moving forward on these things, because you're talking about millionaires. You're not talking about your everyday person that you're going to bump into the street. And so you're talking about a different caliber of person that needs to be taxed. Just because they're out of the ordinary doesn't mean you need to tax them, an out of the ordinary amount. There has to be some sort of fairness.
Okay. So reasonableness is what I keep hearing that theme from you, which is interesting. That's good. This has had a major impact already. 9,000 millionaires have left the state. I just read that the other day. AJ, the millionaires tax, in the way that it's talked about, some people don't understand that it actually affects small businesses because of the pass-through status of the way someone would put together a small business. So how do you feel about this move and overall the way New Jersey is structured from a tax standpoint?
Well, I think that what you see is that the millionaires obviously leave, but we're so overtaxed that it doesn't matter if the millionaires leave because everybody's leaving. I'm not going to be able to afford to live in the state after college, after law school. We have a great education system in our state and higher education system. So obviously we're breeding this talent, and it's like a sports team, right? They draft really well, and they cultivate all of this homegrown talent, and then they just trade it all away. And they don't reap any of the benefits. Right? Right when they're about to hit their prime, they have to leave.
Yeah.
And then when they leave and they set up their roots somewhere else, they're not going to come back. So I think that the issue is that, sure, you're taxing millionaires, but you're not just taxing millionaires. You're taxing everybody, because the millionaires leave, and then somebody's going to have to make that, because guess what? That's counted into Murphy's budget. So when we have a balanced budget amendment in New Jersey, if I'm not mistaken. So that means they have to have a balanced budget when they pass it. So how do they get that? They assume that they're making X amount of dollars. Well, how do they assume that? Based on the taxes that they take. And if we're losing millionaires, we're just going to continue to have the debt, have more and more debt in our state, which will cause taxes to raise on everybody.
Yeah.
And also the millionaires that do stay, like you said, it affects the businesses, because most of them have most of their income tied up in their business, right? And a lot of millionaires in the state aren't millionaires because they own Amazon. They're not Jeff Bezos.
No.
They might own a small chain of fast food places. They might be a general manager or a franchisee of McDonald's.
Yeah.
Sure, that's a big business, but really not. And they own a bunch of them throughout, or a bunch of Wawas even throughout the state. And so they're a millionaire. Sure. But all of their money goes to their business, but they still get taxed the same. And why would you open a business if that's the case?
Yeah, well, we're now the most difficult state to open a business in, and you're right. There's a misunderstanding, I think, in general, all partisan politics aside, of what a millionaire really is on paper, and when you look at a small business owner, what that really means. And I think once people's eyes are open to that, they're shocked that it isn't truly this millionaire that you're thinking of. But obviously, to have all these services, Stephen, you mentioned earlier, believing in bigger government from the standpoint of services to the people that are in need, that takes tax revenue. When those things get out of balance, though, do you see that we begin to lose jobs? How do you strike that balance?
I mean, it is an extraordinarily tough thing to understand and kind of put into the correct perspective. And I think we struggle with that on a lot of things. Balance isn't really a skill that the parties in this country have,
No kidding.
So I don't know if I have a good answer for that question, if I'm being 100% honest with you. I really couldn't give you anything of substance that would answer that.
Well, I think what you're saying is approach it with a balanced view instead of this, extremism that we have, which is spending with absolutely no, sense of where the money's coming from, but yet expecting the money to come from taxes. I mean, there's not a balance there. It's not common sense. I think most people in this state, most people in this country are common sense people. Most people want to look at things that way. So I have to tell you guys, it's really interesting talking to you. We could go on. We need to do this again. I personally feel really encouraged. I didn't know what to expect, but Stephen, I have to tell you, I'm not going to give you a red card because I want you to stay on that side because you're intelligent and you're balanced. And that's a good thing that came out of this. And AJ, your statement about anything too big is not good. Common sense, right, guys? I mean, if we could talk more like this, we could solve more problems. So a last word for both of you, and go ahead, AJ.
Sure. I think my last word is this. If you are going to engage in a conversation with somebody, you have to first engage in a conversation with the person about where their heart is. I think that the problem is we jump into these big disagreements, and we didn't touch on it, but I'm sure we could go down the rabbit hole, and there's much more controversial issues that Steve and I would be so radically polarized on. Like something, I'll say something like abortion, right? Steve and I are probably never going to agree on that issue. We are on such polar opposite sides on that. But at the end of the day, I don't think Stephen is a bad person, and I know he doesn't think that I'm a bad person. We just disagree. We have different ideas on how the world around us works. And I think that that's okay. You have to understand that you're not going to agree with everyone on anything. And if you do, that's really scary too, because that means you don't have an original thought.
Yeah, yeah, good point.
So,
Good point, AJ. I think you're right about that. Stephen, last words from you.
I would say basically the same thing as AJ. When you're going into a conversation with somebody, whether it be online, over Zoom, with your family, your friends, whomever it may be, my personal philosophy is, and maybe it's because I'm a big law geek and I enjoy this stuff, I try and think of myself as a judge. You know, I put my biases aside. I'm here to listen. I'm here to take in what you're trying to tell me and process it and, you know, bounce it against what I think, shoot some things back at you and be a part of a discussion. But at the end of the day, I shouldn't be trying to convince you. You shouldn't be trying to convince me. We should be trying to meet in the middle. And I think that's what makes AJ and I's friendship work so beautifully. I think that's why we do phenomenal things when we talk politically on radio or wherever it may be, is because we have this understanding that answers aren't found on the left or on the right. They're found in the middle ground.
I love it. I love it. You guys are a great model for where we need to be. So there is hope if we can learn from you. We'll have you back because certainly things in this world are not going to calm down anytime soon. There'll be plenty to talk about. We didn't even get into a lot of the issues, but now our viewers understand who you guys are and how you operate together. I think it's fabulous. So thank you to both of you. We will have you guys back, and to our audience, we will see you guys next week. Have a good night.